when we started looking into the idea of exploring video games in a museum, we started working on this exhibition project in I think the initial idea was from 2013, and so basically over the course of 5 years it became what it is now. But we realized that we needed to do a very different thing from what had been done in the early 2000s, which was just bringing video games into a museum and actually instead really kind of critiquing the culture around it and looking at the way that ideas around video games had changed over the last decade or so before. So I think, I'm really interested in what curating video games means to you, because you've got a very different way of working with the medium.
Yeah, so I'm just some asshole who's making it up as he goes along. I have no experience in museums whatsoever. This year actually marks 20 years since I picked up the first version of Unreal Ed and accidentally ended up in games. Because I thought I was going to use it to make non-game stuff, and then got really hooked on designing space for people to play in, which is just this really interesting puzzle. But several times I kind of almost hard bounced back out of video games, because while as a teenager I kind of liked what they were and what the industry does. That didn't last long. And it's like, I just thought I could see there was more to video games as a form than the industry was doing with them, and that's still true now.
I mean, that's really interesting to me as well, because my co-curator on this exhibition came from Wild Rumpus, a collective with Pat here, and had a very different background from me in terms of knowing this kind of much more esoteric side of video games. You know, I'd kind of grown up with the really commercial side. I'd had a PlayStation and carried on in that realm and played the more kind of AAA studio games, and was really interested in kind of exploring that medium and engaging with that. And she really kind of opened my eyes to the much wider world of what's happening in video games outside of the major studios. So whilst we were always going to explore the design processes of really big blockbusters, we also certainly wanted to represent the work of independent designers, be that from small studios or right down to the really physical stuff that you play in like DIY, the kind of collective culture.
I should probably mention what I actually do now. So one of the larger things I curate is called Leftfield, which happens at EGX, which are commercial expos. And that is about showing weird experimental work to existing audiences at those kind of shows. So making it accessible, making it approachable. And then the other thing I do is run Feral Vector, which is a game design festival where we make game designers go outside and do things that don't involve screens, possibly like making things with their hands. In doing those things, I've ended up mostly dealing with independent developers and DIY scenes. I'm really curious about your experiences of dealing with larger studios, because that is something I've given up on.
Okay. So it's very interesting working with large-scale studios. They are aware that they want to be represented as a kind of cultural medium, and initial engagements with these studios tended to be go on a range of levels, from kind of no responses to some people that did want to really engage, but then it was it kind of seemed that it would be too difficult for them. The people in their studio were too busy to be able to work with us, so there would be a lot of kind of responses that we would get, and yet we're trying to engage large-scale studios as a cultural medium, bring them into the wider public. And I also think it's really interesting hearing about people talking about games being somebody mentioned earlier that games as a new medium and how we want to move away from that, and that's this kind of gatekeeperishness of like not being able to bring video games into wider culture because the studios themselves haven't got that understanding, then that to bring a video game into a museum, explore the design processes, and really kind of move these games out of a kind of magical black box type thing, really kind of can expand how people think about this medium and explore new ways of thinking about video games and bring new ideas to it. So it was interesting. It was like negotiating with lots of different studios, and which kind of certainly toward for the first part of the exhibition led to the kind of to some of the choices in some senses of what we were able to display. We would have liked to have worked with other studios perhaps, but actually what we have ended up with is really like wide-ranging selection from big AAA studios through to small independents as well. So I think it's quite a difficult process working with major studios who don't necessarily see the work that they're doing as part of a kind of wider and new culture, really.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say on that, but it would all be really hard. There is, throughout my career in games, I've always seen this kind of almost craven desperation to be taken seriously in a wider cultural context.
Yep.
Coupled with an almost complete inability to talk to institutions and organisations and even just groups of people on anything but commercial terms.
Yes, exactly that. And I think it's so interesting because, one of the amazing things I got to do as part of the research for this project, I went to my first GDC in 2016, and within that space is hundreds and hundreds of people doing amazing talks about the design process that they're going through and all these thoughts about where video games culture should be. But it's also only to another kind of industry audience that are there, that ones that have got a certain either their company sends them there, or some people have managed to get a bursary or whatever, but it's not a wider public. It's and actually to be able to bring some of that thinking to different institutions and to different audiences and showcase that there's so much more that goes into the design process of these products, would really expand the way that people think about it and again help to move the kind of the conversation on from the desperation to be part of games as art type thing, into just thinking of it in the same way that we think about film and even television now and literature.
I still get asked occasionally by very well-meaning people, are video games art? I have a few answers to that question, but my favourite at the moment is, what, all of them?
Yeah, exactly. I think you said we were at a round table recently and you actually used another way of thinking about that as a definition, which I thought was super interesting.
So I see that as a badly formulated question.
Yeah.
And you can break it apart in lots of different ways. But when it's asked as bluntly as are video games art, that is more about the industry's insecurities than anything else. If you reformulate it as something like, could you use the tools that people use to make video games to make art? The answer becomes, well, yes, obviously. But then the obvious follow-on is anyone doing it, and who are they and why? And generally it's not people you'll find exhibiting at EGX outside of Leftfield.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I thought that was such a really good, succinct way of thinking about that question, which I've got asked many, many times during the course of this exhibition, particularly being in London, from press and other kind of people interested in the subject matter that kind of didn't really get what we were trying to do in this space. But I think it's also what you're saying about some games can be, and some people using this tool to do interesting things, and we tried to kind of explore that too. And I also think what the other thing that we really wanted to do, which is what independents do needs to be in the independent space at the kind of is in the independent space at the moment generally, is questioning, you know, the ideas about what video games are. So when we put this exhibition together, we really wanted to feature the voices of people that are changing expectations and challenging notions of what video games are. So the Disrupt section of the exhibition features interviews with people from journalists to games designers to advocates that are really kind of promoting like games as a new medium and trying to change the kind of subject matters that they are about, or challenge the kind of standard questions like, do violent video games make people violent and stuff like that, trying to move those conversations on to somewhere else. Yeah, I think, you know, there's from listening to people's conversations today that are presenting about video games, I think there's loads of interesting different ways that that video games are kind of changing the way that or changing in certain ways that really challenge those perceptions. But I think what you're doing with Feral Vector particularly is a really interesting way of trying to change the way that people, like designers themselves and people that attend your festival, like think about video games. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
I guess like something I've always had a really clear mental model of is how culture works, and the fact that wherever people are gathered together, like even in this room right now, we're creating culture however temporary it is. And there's an author named Harkin Bay who has this concept of the temporary autonomous zone, which really started to influence my thinking when I was organizing much more industry-focused conferences, and finding they just kind of repeated this cycle in general. Beyond any kind of technical talks, which tend to be very current, the rest tends to be this ever-repeating news cycle of the same issues, the same controversies that no one ever really adequately addresses. And it just feels like everyone's trapped. And I started trying to steer things and influence them, and then eventually realized I just needed to take a big group of people, as big as possible, away from that and put them in a completely different context to do other things. And at first, I was doing indie conferences. I took a year out because I was very bored of conferences, and then figured out that I just needed to give people space to do things, and it didn't have to be a talk. It didn't have to have that format. It didn't have to have any of that polish. And in fact, like, engendering that kind of DIY scene was a much more exciting thing, which I'd seen through various stuff from my past. Like around the turn of the century, in my hometown, there are a bunch of arts collectives that lived in abandoned factories and threw parties in them. They were absolutely fantastic. Like, that's a part of my life I treasure and forever want to recreate in some way, because that environment would create all of these amazing chaotic collisions that did stuff a conference in San Francisco does not.
Mm-hmm. So I think maybe we could take a few questions from the audience, if anybody has anything you want to ask.
How did you find and choose the independent games that are in the exhibition?
That's a really interesting question. So you know, there's it's just lots of research. We I think there were different. So the three elements of the exhibition, the first one looks specifically at the kind of the mode of design production, whilst the middle section is more about the kind of issues that are raised by particular video games, with the final section being a kind of celebration of the DIY culture. And there's different elements to that. So in the first section, we really wanted to cover a range of bases of video games, ones that really kind of push the boundaries in this period that we're talking about. In the middle section, it was ones that really were kind of addressing particular issues that we thought were prevalent in video games culture. And finally, in the last section, were ones that I think, particularly that's Marie's background working in this kind of DIY collective, ones that have a really kind of performative element of them, but also kind of the arcade games, for instance, really actually are something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in standard arcades such as Anthropy's work, what designers that really kind of also been influential in this space, in pushing boundaries about what games are.
It's really interesting, some of the ideas that have been discussed here today. In my mind, we've almost come full circle, because we are now celebrating lots of independent game developers springing up everywhere, which I think is fantastic. But the industry started with independent game developers in their bedrooms, and that seems to be an omission that I think that we've kind of overlooked, especially in the exhibition here. Not a criticism, I just think it's an interesting omission. So what was the thinking there?
So we wanted to do an exhibition about video games. That's a huge subject matter. And we looked to a particular time and period where due to a number of factors that including, access to broadband and smartphones has really massively increased how many people play video games, how many people engage with video games in different ways beyond just playing them. So talking about them, changing the way that people think about them, but also, we looked at like fan art and the way that people share creations that they've done in Minecraft online. So it was really about a specific period from around the mid-2000s. I'm very aware that like a lot of earlier video games are from much more, independent bedroom coders and stuff like that. But that wasn't something that we could explore in this particular exhibition. But it's certainly something for, future research, absolutely, and displays.
It's a bit of a perennial curatorial question, but can you reveal a little bit about who tends to support financially both of your endeavours, and who tend to be the more supportive when it comes to the more avant-garde or experimental or indie works?
it's the patrons.
Third announcement. The museum will be closing in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Shall I take that first?
Yeah, I think that.
So in the case of Leftfield, that is sponsored by Sega. And it started out as basically, it used to be called the Indie Games Arcade, and there's a whole discussion there about the term indie becoming meaningless in commercial spaces, so we changed the name. At the time, I was working for another employer and basically nagged them for a year around 2008 until they too were convinced, yes, indie games were about to become important. We just asked them, for their first show, we asked, would you give us a dozen PCs to show some weird indie games on? And we all thought it would just be this flash in the pan thing, and that no one would bother to visit it. And they did stick us upstairs, around a corner, behind a career fair, behind a LAN area. And everyone spent the whole show saying, have you seen the weird indie games bit upstairs? And after that, Sega got involved and have been really supportive consistently. And it's not even in a kind of self-interested way. I don't think they've ever published anything that's gone through Leftfield. They actually believe in kind of giving something back in that way. With Feral Vector, it's been much harder. There was a year I spent a month producing the best, glossiest sponsor pack I've ever done and shopping it out to 60 different people at different companies and got nothing, absolutely nothing. I've had startups with serious amounts of funding approach me saying hey, we're looking to fund stuff, we've heard Feral Vector's exciting. Then when I describe it to them, they run. So there have been some difficult years. It started in London and then I moved it up to Yorkshire because I specifically wanted outdoor space, and it's very close to my house now. Going all the way down to London became a hassle. Audiences were declining, costs were going up. It obviously wasn't going to keep working there. For the past 3 years, it's been supported largely by patronage on top of ticket sales. Ticket sales alone will never fully cover Feral Vector. And this past year we did a crowdfunder, which ended up serving as a really good advert for the fact that we have patronage. So quite a few people approached me on top of the crowdfunder to say hey, we've had a really successful game, can we put some money in? But the most kind of, the biggest kind of tier in terms of financial support for Feral Vector is independent developers and studios that are still quite small and have had really successful games. and want to give back to the scenes and communities that they came from?
From my point of view, it's actually, I think, we got no money from any industry. There was no kind of compensation or anything from the video games industry, so that didn't influence anything that we chose to showcase in the exhibition itself. So, and also it was actually quite hard to engage the usual sponsors of cultural institutions exhibitions to sponsor us too, actually. So whereas a fashion exhibition might get somebody like American Express sponsoring them, which has no necessary connection, it was basically we didn't get any funding outside of what was already apportioned as part of the V&A's budget to this. We didn't get any outside funding because it wasn't necessarily within the cultural realm of the standard sponsors. So it's actually quite an interesting question, and kind of talks about what we were saying, where we want to try and bring this into the cultural realm, but it's still not kind of considered in the same way as they might do fashion or art.